They stripped her bare in the snow, no mercy, no shame. Her late husband's kin called it justice, said she shamed the family name. But all Clara did was stand her ground. And for that, they left her with torn clothes, bruised skin, and no place to crawl to. Then came the rancher, a man who spoke little, but when he did, people listened. No one expected Eli Brannon to step in, least of all Clara. But when he dismounted, tossed his coat over her shoulders, and faced her in-laws like a storm rolling in, the West held its breath. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wind cut across the open plains like a blade, carving through Clara's bones as she staggered down the frozen dirt path that once led to her home, now nothing but a shadow behind her. Snow clung to her bare feet in clumps, the skin blistering and red where it wasn't scraped raw. Her once pristine Sunday dress, cream-colored with tiny blue blossoms, was torn at the hem and ripped across the back where Josiah Callister had grabbed her and thrown her into the yard like refuse. Blood flecked the collar where her lip had split. Her hair, long and once neatly braided by Daniel's gentle hands, hung in damp, tangled strands across her face. She didn't cry. Not anymore. Her tears had frozen on her cheeks an hour ago, just before Miriam Callister, her sister-in-law, struck her for speaking Daniel's name with defiance. They called it justice, said she was a liar, a whore, a thief who dared accuse her dead husband's kin of betrayal. But Clara had seen it plain, saw the bruises Daniel hid, the late-night whispers between his brother Nate and the traveling men with coin-stuffed pouches, the ledger she wasn't supposed to find tucked behind the whiskey shelf. She'd brought it to the table after Daniel's burial, laid it down with shaking hands and said, "Tell me what this means." And they had. Just not with words. What followed was a storm of shouting, slurs, accusations, all erupting like wildfire, until Josiah dragged her by the arm, slapped her hard across the cheek, and Miriam tore the locket from her neck. They said the land wasn't hers, that Daniel's death freed them of any obligation to keep a barren wife in their house. And when she refused to leave, Josiah shoved her into the snow and said, "Then freeze with your lies." The ranch door slammed behind her like a gunshot. Now, each breath Clara drew stung her throat like dry cotton. The world blurred in white and gray and blue horizon and sky melting together in a bitter, pitiless wash of winter. Her knees buckled once, then again. She pressed on with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, clutching what little warmth remained in her shivering frame. She thought of Daniel, not the pale, cold body in the pine casket, but the way he'd laugh with his whole chest, how he'd sneak sugar cubes to the foals when no one watched. He would have fought for her, if he could, but he was gone, and she was alone. The snow deepened as she crossed the edge of the pasture, the fence line curling like the spine of the world into the hills beyond. Blood seeped from her ankle, where a stone had sliced her. She faltered, dropping to one knee, her breath ragged and shallow. In the distance, a shape loomed black against the drifting white. A horse, still as stone, a man astride it, wrapped in a long coat, his silhouette motionless against the wind. She blinked, unsure if he was real or some conjuring of desperation. Then darkness closed in. Clara fell forward into the snow, arms limp at her sides, her last exhale disappearing into the cold as the silence swallowed everything. Everything but the sound of slow, deliberate hoofbeats approaching. Eli Brannon sat tall in the saddle, a worn slouch hat pulled low over his brow, the brim lined with frost, the wind threading through the tattered edges of his duster like ghost fingers. He'd been riding the northern line, checking for broken rails and wolf tracks, when he saw the figure in the snow, small, stumbling, then falling hard just beyond the fence that marked the edge of his land. For a long moment, he didn't move, just stared. The winter sky stretched dull and endless above, but Eli's gaze stayed rooted to that single fragile shape in the white. He saw the way she clutched her arms to her chest, the stains on her dress, the slow collapse of her body like a marionette with strings cut. He didn't need to ride closer to know who it was, Clara Callister, Daniel's widow. Word of the incident at the Callister ranch had already wormed its way through the hills like all foul things did. Folks at the feed store whispered that she'd gone mad. Others said she was a gold digger trying to claw her way into the deed. And some, the ones Eli had learned to half trust, said she'd just asked the wrong questions and stood too tall for a woman in that house. Eli had known Daniel in passing a decent enough man, quiet like himself, who didn't drink hard and always tipped his hat. Dead now, under murky circumstances. But it was Clara he remembered clearer. The way she sat straight at Sunday gatherings, how she once helped a runaway mule calm its fit in front of the mercantile, all while her in-laws barked orders like drill sergeants. She had steel in her, Eli thought. Or had. What lay in the snow now looked hollowed out, stripped of heat and hope and pride. His hand tightened on the reins. For years, Eli had made peace with silence. After the war, after the blood, after burying friends and his own younger brother in shallow, forgotten graves, he'd come to the ridge country to vanish, built a ranch with blistered hands, refused callers, and let the world pass him by like dust on the wind. But something twisted in his gut watching Clara fall. A different kind of pain, old but waking like the ache of a scar before rain. He clicked his tongue once, and the horse descended the slope in steady strides. Snow crunched beneath hooves. As he neared, he could see the bluish tint in her lips, the way her eyes fluttered like wings struggling to stay aloft. Her fingers, red and cracked, still clung to a torn scrap of cloth that had once been a bodice. Not a thief, not a whore, just a woman left to die. He swung down from the saddle, boots thudding heavy in the snow, and stood over her for a second that felt like a judgment. Then, wordless, he unfastened the buttons of his coat, an old cavalry issue, wool-lined, fraying at the collar, and wrapped it gently around her shaking frame. She didn't speak, couldn't, but her eyes opened for the briefest moment and met his. Not pleading, just surprised, like kindness was the last thing she expected. He scooped her up, arms strong from a life of labor, and carried her toward the dark outline of his ranchstead beyond the fence. Behind them, the snow kept falling, soft and cruel and indifferent, covering the footprints like the world trying to pretend none of it ever happened. The next morning, the wind had dulled, but the air still carried the sharp bite of mountain cold, slicing through bone and breath as if the land itself wanted to remember the violence it had hosted. Clara sat upright on the edge of Eli's modest cot, the coat draped over her shoulders like a shield from a world gone cruel. The inside still held his warmth, faint but real, and she clung to it with fingers that trembled less than the night before. Eli had said nothing when he brought her in, not even as he lit the stove and set a kettle to boil, not even when he laid a folded blanket at her feet and left her a chipped enamel mug of broth on the small table. She hadn't spoken either, her throat too raw, her heart too bruised. But something had shifted in that quiet room, something steady, grounded, immovable. When the sun rose high enough to melt a sliver of frost from the window pane, Clara stood, pulled the coat tighter, and stepped outside. The ranch sat quiet and weathered, a sprawl of fence lines, lean-to sheds, and one main barn painted the color of old rust. Chickens clucked lazily in a half-sheltered coop. 2 cattle milled along the far pasture. It wasn't much, but it breathed peace, and that made it feel like a palace. That was when she saw them. 3 figures standing near the outer fence, boots crunching slowly through the snow. Josiah, Miriam, and the youngest of the Callister brood, Nate. Eli emerged from the barn then, silent as a shadow, a lasso looped casually over his shoulder. His eyes found them without surprise. Clara's breath caught. Josiah looked smug, as if he'd come to reclaim something. Miriam wore the pinched scowl of a woman who'd never been denied anything long enough to appreciate its weight. And Nate's gaze darted between Clara and Eli, uncertainty flickering in his eyes like a wick unsure if it wants to hold fire. "We come for the girl," Josiah said, his voice loud, drawing itself tall. "She's trespassing." Eli didn't flinch, didn't blink. He said nothing, just walked to the fence, unhurried, then hooked the lasso over a post like it wasn't a weapon at all. The wind picked up, catching the tail of his coat, his stance like granite forged in silence. Josiah opened his mouth again, but this time, he hesitated. There was something about Eli Brannon that made men swallow their pride before they knew they were choking on it. War did that to some men. It burned away the noise, left only the necessary. And Eli, with those eyes hard as worn steel and a name that carried whispers all through the county, didn't need threats to make men listen. "She's under my roof," he said at last, his voice low and sure as thunder rumbling on the horizon. "And under my name if it comes to that." Nate's face paled. Miriam reached for Josiah's arm, but he stood stiff. Still, they said nothing else. In the stillness, Clara moved one step closer to Eli. Just one. The coat hung heavy around her, and yet she felt no burden. She looked straight at them, her tormentors, and they looked away. For the first time since Daniel's death, they turned from her. And in their retreat, she found breath, found her spine, found the spark Daniel always said was there. The Callisters backed off with stiff shoulders and frozen pride. And though they didn't know it yet, the war had just begun. But Clara? She wasn't cold anymore. Not in that coat. Not beside that man. Not with justice stirring quietly in the marrow of her bones. The ranch was a quiet place, tucked low in the valley where the hills cradled it from wind and time. A patch of earth that looked as worn and resolute as the man who kept it. The cabin, built of rough-hewn logs darkened by years of sun and rain, stood with a kind of stubborn dignity, its porch sagging but solid, its chimney puffing thin streams of smoke that smelled of cedar and ash. Inside, everything was simple, unadorned shelves holding tinware and dry goods, a single bed with a wool blanket tucked tight, and a narrow table set with 2 plates, though only one had been used in years. Eli didn't speak much as he showed Clara inside, only pointed to the wash basin and the folded towel near the stove where water simmered in a kettle, then stepped back outside to give her space. She stripped slowly, wincing at bruises that bloomed along her ribs and shoulder blades, watching steam rise from the warm water as she dipped a cloth and pressed it to her skin. The fire snapped softly behind her, and his coat hung nearby, draped over a chair like a sentry. She scrubbed until her skin stung, until the cold had been chased from her bones, and when she emerged wrapped in one of Eli's flannel shirts that fit like a blanket. He had left a plate of beans and cornbread on the table, still warm, with a tin cup of boiled coffee beside it. No questions, no prying, just quiet provision. Days passed like that. Clara rose early and helped with chores she barely understood, gathering eggs, hauling feed, repairing a split fence rail under Eli's watchful eye. He showed her how to mend wire, how to lift with her knees, how to spot storm signs in the sky. Still, they spoke little. And yet in the hush between them, something steady formed a rhythm of glances, nods, small gestures that spoke more than conversation ever could. But nights were different. At night, the stillness fractured. Clara would lie on the cot near the fire while Eli took the old leather armchair, boots off but gun close, and she'd hear it soft at first, then rougher as sleep loosened his grip. Names murmured into the dark, orders barked in gasps. Ples whispered like apologies. She didn't ask who they were. Didn't need to. War had marked him, not just in the limp he hid well or the jagged scar under his jaw, but in the way he stared at fire like it owed him something. Clara had ghosts too. Her husband's eyes when he realized the truth too late, the bruises she hid for weeks before the final explosion, the helplessness of being outnumbered in her own home. And somehow, in that cabin filled with silence and echoes, her ghosts began to quiet, not vanish, but settle. She began to sleep through the night, her hand resting on the coat at the foot of the bed like a tether. Eli, too, seemed less restless. He started leaving a second cup on the table each morning, sometimes even nodding toward the porch swing as if inviting her to watch the sun rise with him. Once, as they worked side by side fixing a broken shutter, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something deeper. 2 people learning to breathe in the aftermath of storms, not speaking their pain but holding space for it. And in that shelter of unspoken understanding, something fragile began to grow. It was just past midday when the sound of hooves tore across the stillness like thunder on dry earth, breaking the rhythm of quiet chores and stirring the dust that had settled around the Brannon Ranch. Clara stepped out from the barn with a coil of rope in hand, her sleeves rolled and fingers blistered from mending fence posts, only to stop cold as the Callisters came into view, Josiah leading the way on a black gelding that foamed at the mouth, Miriam sitting straight-backed in a side saddle like a vulture in Sunday lace, and behind them, Nate rode with his eyes low, jaw tight, beside the county sheriff whose badge glinted like fool's gold under the Sunday. Eli didn't say a word at first, simply stepped from the porch where he'd been whittling a fence peg, set the knife down with slow care, and walked to stand beside Clara, his boots crunching in the gravel. His arms crossed over his chest, face impassive, body still as a loaded spring. Josiah dismounted first, slapping dust from his coat like he owned the ground beneath him. "She's a thief," he announced, holding up a folded sheet of paper like it was scripture. "That land Daniel left? Fraud. That brooch on her collar stolen from Miriam's mother. And she's got no claim here. No right to hide behind another man's walls." The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly, then began to read from the document in hand a legal-sounding list of grievances dripping with falsified authority, every word sharpened to humiliate. Clara stood tall, eyes fixed on Josiah, the wind catching strands of her hair as if refusing to let her look small. The lies burned, but the fear didn't reach her bones like before, not with Eli beside her, solid as the oak tree by the well. When the sheriff finished, silence fell like dust after a stampede. Eli let it hang, let the weight of it press into every corner of the ranch yard before speaking. "I've seen plenty of paper in my time," he said, voice low but cutting, through the air like a blade. "Orders signed in ink while men bled in mud. You want to take her based on that, you'll need more than a sheriff with a stammer and kinfolk with dirty hands." He stepped forward, just enough for the Callisters to feel the heat behind the words. "You want her? Bring proof. Bring truth. Or bring a shovel, 'cause it'll be your boots in the dirt next." The threat wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Even the sheriff's horse shifted uneasily. Nate opened his mouth to speak, but faltered when Eli's gaze met his. A flicker of conscience lived in that boy's eyes, but it was buried under layers of fear and family pride. Miriam made a disgusted sound and turned her horse sharply. Josiah lingered a moment longer, lips curled in disdain, but the weight of Eli's presence was too much, and with a sharp jerk of the reins, he mounted and rode off without another word. The sheriff followed, muttering something about needing to look into it further. Clara exhaled slowly as the sound of hooves faded into the hills. Eli didn't look at her, just picked up his knife again, sat back on the porch step, and resumed whittling. But she knew what had happened. He hadn't just defended her. He'd drawn a line in the dirt, and the Callisters had seen it, clear as day. They'd be back. But next time, they'd come ready for war. The storm rolled in slow that evening, not the kind with thunder or lightning, but the kind that carried a hush across the land like a warning, a quiet so deep even the chickens stopped clucking and the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara was in the tack room, digging through old gear for a saddle blanket, when her fingers brushed against a tear in the underside of Daniel's old trail saddle, the one he rode when they first courted, the one she hadn't seen since his death. Her brow furrowed as she picked at the stitching, and there, wedged into the lining beneath cracked leather, was a folded envelope yellowed with time, sealed with wax now crumbled at the edges. Her hands shook as she opened it, breath catching when she saw his handwriting uneven, ink smudged, but undeniably Daniel's. She read each word like it was a prayer, a curse, and a confession all in one. "Clara," it began, "if you're reading this, they've done what I feared they might. I tried to stop them, I swear it, but blood runs thicker than fear, and my fear wasn't for myself. It was always for you." He wrote of ledgers he'd seen, payments in cash passed through false cattle sales, men from the city coming in with dead eyes and clean boots, names signed on land deeds that vanished months later. "It's Josiah," he admitted. "And Miriam, too. They've got Nate scared half to death. I tried to speak up once. Got a cracked rib for my trouble and a warning to keep my mouth shut or end up trampled under a wild horse." He wrote of their plan to pin the fraud on Clara if he ever turned. "I wanted to run," the letter ended. "Wanted to take you and go north, where nobody knows the Callister name. But I waited too long, and now I think they see it in my eyes that I won't stay quiet forever. If something happens to me, protect yourself. Don't trust them. And remember, I never stopped loving you." Clara sat on the tack room floor for a long time, the letter pressed to her chest, her tears soaking into worn barnwood, the scent of old leather and hay surrounding her like memory. That night, as the oil lamp flickered against the porch wall and crickets chirped in cautious rhythm, she sat beside Eli and read the letter aloud, her voice soft but sure, each word trembling with weight. Eli didn't interrupt, didn't blink, just sat with his forearms resting on his knees, staring out at the darkened yard like he was watching shadows take shape. When she finished, the silence stretched until it snapped under the tension in his jaw. His teeth grinding behind lips pressed into a hard line. His fists clenched once, then relaxed, fingers twitching like they remembered the trigger of a rifle. Still, he said nothing. But Clara saw it in the way his chest rose with shallow breath, the way his eyes shifted from the yard to the tree line and back. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating. Mourning too, maybe, in the way men like Eli mourn with fury wrapped in restraint. She laid the letter beside the lamp, its edges fluttering slightly in the breeze, and reached for the coffee he'd poured her earlier. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew something had shifted. Daniel's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a message. And now, armed with his final words, Clara and Eli weren't just waiting for the Callisters to make another move. They were preparing to make one of their own. The fire came in the dead of night, sudden and ravenous, splitting the darkness with an orange howl that licked the sky and turned the valley into a canvas of flickering horror. Clara woke first, smoke already creeping beneath the cabin door, her lungs tightening as she shouted Eli's name. Scrambling into boots and tossing open the door to see the east barn fully ablaze, timbers crackling like gunshots, horses screaming in terror. Eli was already there, shirt half-buttoned, hauling water from the well with the urgency of a man who'd fought too many battles to panic now. They worked in rhythm, no words, just motion buckets passed, stall doors flung open, hooves pounding past them into the night. The barn couldn't be saved, but the livestock could, and by dawn, what remained was a smoking skeleton of charred beams and blackened earth. The sheriff arrived hours later, slow as molasses and twice as useless, scratching his head and mumbling about lack of evidence, while refusing to even look toward the Callister property across the hills. Could have been lightning, he said without conviction, despite the clear skies and dry ground. Clara didn't respond. Neither did Eli. They both knew who had done this, and so did the sheriff, but knowing and proving were two different things in a town where the Callisters' name had long shadowed the truth. Word traveled fast. By noon, half the town had found some excuse to ride past Eli's ranch, some out of concern, others out of curiosity, but most just to see if the stories were true. They watched from saddles and wagon seats as Eli and Clara began clearing the wreckage, their movements slow but deliberate, sleeves rolled, faces streaked with soot and sweat. Clara's hands didn't shake this time. She gripped the axe steady, splintering beams and stacking what little salvage could be saved. Eli moved beside her, eyes sharp, jaw locked, not in silence born of avoidance, but one forged in shared resolve. They didn't speak because they didn't need to. Every glance, every nail hammered into fresh wood was a defiance louder than any threat. When the preacher rode by and offered a soft, "Need help?" Eli simply nodded once, and by dusk, a second pair of hands was on the roof frame. The following day, 2 more neighbors joined, bringing spare nails and a sack of grain. The Callisters had meant to send a warning, but instead, they'd lit a signal fire. And while the sheriff played dumb and the law turned its face, the town began to shift, not with outrage or open rebellion, but with something far more dangerous: quiet sympathy. The blacksmith's wife left a hot pie on their doorstep. The general store owner gave Clara a bolt of fabric without charging a cent. Even old man Wexley, who hadn't spoken to Eli in 5 years, showed up with a new pitchfork and muttered, "Damn shame, that fire." The tide was turning, not with banners and rifles, but with hushed voices and watching eyes. And as the new barn frame took shape, rising slow and stubborn from the ashes, Clara looked across the hills and felt something stir, not fear, not even anger anymore, but clarity. They wanted her silent. They wanted Eli isolated, but what they'd done instead was give them purpose. And purpose, once ignited, burned hotter than any fire the Callisters could set. The courthouse sat heavy in the center of Dust Hollow like a tombstone. No one dared move its stone walls weathered by decades of injustice, and its rafters soaked in the echoes of voices long ignored. That morning, Clara stood beneath its creaking beams, the cold of the floorboards seeping through Eli's worn boots, the hem of her borrowed wool skirt brushing the scuffed floor as she faced the bench with her back straight and her chin high. On the opposite side, the Callisters lounged like wolves fat on privilege, Josiah smug in a press suit that reeked of arrogance, Miriam fanning herself with an air of martyrdom, and Nate trying not to meet Clara's eyes, His hands clenched beneath the table where their attorney, a snake-eyed man from the city, laid out documents and spoke in oily tones. They'd come armed with forged deeds and rewritten wills, claiming Clara had manipulated Daniel, that she had fabricated the letter, that her presence on the Brannon ranch was nothing short of squatting. A grieving family, the lawyer said, seeks only to protect what rightfully belongs to them. Clara's heart pounded, her breath catching at the base of her throat, as the judge, a weary man with silver hair and a slow blink, glanced at her with tired expectation. For a moment, she thought her voice might fail, might tremble too hard to be heard. But then she felt the weight of the letter in her coat pocket, the warmth of the coat itself now draped over the back of her chair, the way Eli had placed it there without a word before she stood. He sat behind her now, eyes steady, jaw locked, hands folded. And she remembered Daniel not as a corpse buried too young, but as the man who once whispered to her that courage wasn't about not fearing the fire, it was about walking through it anyway. So Clara stepped forward, held out the letter in shaking hands, and began to read. Her voice cracked on the first few lines, but she kept going, breathing through the quake until the words steadied into iron. She read Daniel's confession, the names, the threats, the plan to run, and then she spoke, not just to the judge but to the room, to the weight of the Callisters' legacy and the silence that had protected it. My husband was scared, but not of me. He wanted out, and they took that choice from him. This letter is his voice, and I'm not here to beg for land, or money, or pity. I'm here to end what he started, to speak what he couldn't. A hush settled over the courtroom like snowfall, the kind of silence that comes after something sacred has been spoken aloud. The Callisters shifted uneasily. Their lawyer cleared his throat, but the judge raised a hand, no more interruptions. Eli stood when asked, offering a quiet, unwavering testimony of the night Clara collapsed on his land, the fire that followed, the threats that preceded it. He spoke few words, but each one landed with the weight of stone. When the judge recessed to his chambers, the room buzzed with tension, but Clara didn't move. She simply sat, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the window where sunlight streamed through the dust like a promise. The Callisters had expected her to break. Instead, they watched a woman who had lost everything stand taller than they ever had. And though the verdict had not yet come, everyone in that room felt the shift, the beginning of the end of the Callisters' dominion, and the rise of something far more dangerous to them, truth-given voice. When the judge returned, his boots echoed against the hardwood floor like distant gunfire, the kind that makes every man sit straighter and every lie flinch before the truth. He didn't draw out the moment with legalese or ceremony, just cleared his throat, looked over his spectacles at the crowded room, and spoke with the weariness of a man who'd seen too many falsehoods dressed in silk. In the matter of Clara May Callister versus the Callister estate, he began, glancing once at Clara, once at the trio seated stiffly across the room. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The words fell into the silence like a hammer, and for one sharp second, no one moved. Then murmurs rose from the benches, soft, stunned, some disbelieving, others vindicated, while Josiah Callister's face went tight with fury, his knuckles white as bone against the arms of his chair. The judge wasn't finished. He lifted a second paper and continued, this time with clipped precision. Daniel Callister's letter is authenticated and entered into record. The court acknowledges intent of transfer of property and affirms legal ownership of the disputed ranch to Mrs. Clara Callister. Furthermore, due to submission of fraudulent documents and false testimony, the Callister family is ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $500 to Mrs. Callister, effective immediately. At that, Miriam gasped, her fan dropping with a sharp clap against the floor, and Nate, the only one of them who hadn't sneered throughout the hearing, looked down at his boots, shame blooming across his features like bruises he'd given himself. Clara didn't move, didn't cry, didn't flinch. She simply stood, spine straight as a fence post, and nodded once. She hadn't come for revenge. She hadn't come to ruin them. She came for truth. And now, with that truth echoing through the rafters of the courthouse, something far greater had been won. The Callisters were no longer untouchable. Their myth, the illusion of unshakable power and inherited righteousness, had cracked open under the weight of a widow's defiance. And the town felt it. The crowd parted as Clara stepped down from the bench, not with pity, but with something close to respect. Eli met her at the door, hat in hand, eyes steady. He didn't speak, but she saw it in the slight nod he gave her, the smallest shift in the lines of his face, approval, pride, and maybe, deep beneath it all, the stirrings of peace. Outside, the sky had opened up in soft gray light, and the air smelled of dust and hope. Clara paused at the courthouse steps, letting the moment settle over her, letting the wind carry away the last weight of fear from her chest. She didn't smile. There was no triumph in her face. Just a long, slow breath pulled deep into her lungs, the first breath in weeks that didn't carry the sting of dread or the burn of injustice. Around her, the townsfolk watched quietly, and she knew the stories would spread by nightfall. How the Callisters lost in broad daylight. How a woman with nothing but a letter and grit had broken a legacy with the truth. She turned toward the road, Eli falling into step beside her, and they walked without hurry, without need for words. Behind them, the Callisters sat still in the courtroom, their grip on Dust Hollow melting like thawed ice beneath the spring Sunday. The land was Clara's now. The fight was over. But the West had changed, and everyone knew it. The morning came soft and gold, the kind that stretches long shadows across the hills and smells faintly of sagebrush and new beginnings. The ranch was quiet, still wrapped in the hush of dawn, save for the rhythmic clink of a cinch buckle and the creak of saddle leather as Eli Brannon tightened the girth on his mare. He moved with practiced silence, his gear already packed, bedroll lashed behind the cantle, canteen full. The sun was just cresting over the ridge when Clara stepped onto the porch, arms folded against the chill, her hair braided loosely down one shoulder, a look of calm masking the thrum in her chest. She hadn't known he'd planned to leave, but she'd felt it coming. Eli was never one to linger where peace had already been won. When she walked down the path, bare feet brushing dew-wet grass, she saw at his coat, that old cavalry wool, draped carefully over her front gate. It hung there like a banner, a passing of something sacred. Her heart knocked once against her ribs, then again. She reached for it, but didn't put it on. Not yet. Instead, she stepped out to the edge of the yard, just as Eli swung up into the saddle, eyes scanning the horizon as if already half gone. "You never asked," she called, breath-catching. He paused, turned slightly in the saddle, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. "Asked what?" "Why I stayed," she said, voice clearer now, shoulders squaring like she was standing before that judge again. For a moment, he just looked at her, quiet as ever, then gave a slow nod that spoke volumes. "Didn't need to," he said at last. Then, with a flick of the reins, he added, "You were always the one holding the line." Clara stood there, motionless, as his horse moved into the open pasture, dust rising behind them in a curling trail that shimmered in the early light. She didn't cry. She didn't run after him. She simply watched, a soft breeze tugging at the edges of her skirt, the coat on the gate flapping like a flag in slow motion. And when the last glimpse of Eli disappeared beyond the rise, swallowed by the wild stretch of country he called home, she turned back toward the ranch with new weight in her step, not a burden, but an inheritance. She took the coat from the gate, pulled it over her shoulders, and breathed in its scent, smoke, sweat, and something quiet and unbreakable. Around her, the land stirred with life. Birdsong, the low grunt of a waking calf, the wind threading through the grass like a lullaby for the earth. The town would still talk. They'd wonder where the rancher went and why he left so soon. But Clara knew. Some men come to finish a fight, some come to build. Eli had done both, and now it was her turn to live what he'd helped protect. As she stood beneath the rising sun, coat tight around her shoulders, the West breathed with her wild, fierce, unbroken. And somewhere beyond the hills, where dust becomes sky and sky becomes legend, the name Clara Callister began to carry weight. Not the weight of a widow, not of a victim, but of a woman who stood, endured, and rose. And the land whispered back, "Justice wears new boots now."